Well, I'm retiring, but yeah, probably. Are you being serious, or are you screwing with me? I'm being fairly serious. For decades, Jim Carrey was the wild-faced comedy genius who could make the world laugh without saying a single word. The rubber-faced jokes, million-dollar movies, and red carpet fame, something deeper was always brewing. Now at 64, after years of stepping away from Hollywood, Carrey is finally speaking openly about the struggles, tragedies, and strange rumors that have followed him for years. His latest public appearance even sparked a bizarre conspiracy that shocked the internet. So what exactly has he finally revealed, and why are fans convinced something about him has changed? On February 26, 2026, in Paris at the César Awards, France, the equivalent of the Oscars, Jim Carrey walked onto the stage to accept an honorary César. The audience erupted in applause. But within hours of the first photos hitting the internet, something shifted. Instead of celebrating, social media exploded with speculation. People began zooming in on his face and comparing old photos to new, ones side by side. Some said his eyes looked lighter. Others insisted his cheekbones looked different or his nose seemed off. Then someone noticed he was signing autographs with his right hand, despite being famously left-handed. Comment sections spiraled instantly. People wrote that it wasn't really Jim Carrey. Some claimed his spirit felt different. Others insisted nobody could impersonate him that well. The speculation reached another level when celebrity impersonator Alexis Stone posted photos on Instagram wearing facial prosthetics and a wig styled to resemble Carrey's new appearance. Captioned Alexis Stone as Jim Carrey in Paris. Suddenly the internet was convinced something strange was happening. Even celebrities joined the conversation. Megan Fox posted that she couldn't handle any more stress and needed to know if it was real. Lisa Rinna weighed in, and reality TV personalities questioned whether the appearance was legitimate. Within hours, the theory jumped from Twitter threads to celebrity culture. The idea that Jim Carrey had somehow been cloned and replaced. Eventually, his representatives stepped in to shut the rumor down completely. They confirmed that the 64-year-old actor had indeed attended the ceremony in person. Organizers of the César Awards also clarified that Carrey had been in discussions with the Academy for 8 months before the event. He had reportedly spent months preparing his acceptance speech in French, practicing pronunciation carefully. He arrived with his partner, his daughter, his grandson, his publicist, and a group of close friends. Director Michel Gondiria, longtime collaborator, was also there. According to organizers, Carrey was generous, kind, and elegant during the evening. The controversy, they said, was simply a non-issue, but the real question isn't whether he was cloned. The real question is why Jim Carrey looks so different now. For most of his career, the elastic face, the wild body language, and the explosive comedy were more than just talent. They were armor. During the height of his fame, Carrey seemed unstoppable. He delivered blockbuster after blockbuster, commanded record-breaking salaries, and filled theaters with audiences laughing uncontrollably. Yet people who knew him early in his career described something else entirely. They remembered a young comedian who was relentless and obsessive, driven by something deeper than ambition. He didn't just want laughter, he needed it. Even during the peak of his fame, there were strange moments that hinted something deeper was happening. In interviews, he sometimes spoke philosophically about identity and existence. In one 2009 press appearance, he seemed distant, almost disconnected, as if the person everyone expected wasn't fully present. Meanwhile, he was quietly painting dark expressionist artwork filled with intense emotion pieces that looked nothing like the joyful performer audiences saw on screen. In a moment on Late Show with David Letterman, he even paused mid-joke as if the mask had slipped for a second. Most people laughed, but a few noticed the flicker of something more serious underneath. Gradually, he began stepping away from Hollywood's constant spotlight. Press tours became less frequent. Movies appeared further apart. Eventually, the silence between projects stretched so long that it seemed like he had vanished. Many people wondered what had broken Jim Carrey, but perhaps the better question is whether he had ever been fully unbroken in the first place. James Eugene Carrey was born on January 17, 1962, in Newmarket, Ontario, Canada. His childhood looked ordinary from the outside, but inside the family struggled deeply. His father, Percy Carrey, worked as an accountant until he lost his job in the mid-1970s. Almost overnight, the family fell into poverty. At one point, they lived in a Volkswagen camper van near Lake Ontario. Jim and his brother slept in a tent during brutal Canadian winters, while their parents tried to hold everything together. As a teenager, he took night shifts, cleaning factories with his father, just to help the family survive. By the time he was 16, he had dropped out of school, entirely so he could work full-time and care for his ill mother. His father remained the most powerful influence in his life. Percy had once dreamed of becoming a musician, but gave up that dream for stability, and the disappointment slowly consumed him. In 1982, when Jim was 20, he came home to find his father unconscious. After a pill overdose during a severe mental health crisis, Percy survived. But the experience left a lasting mark on Jim. Years later, he would say, "You never truly forget seeing a parent in that state." Despite everything, Carrey kept pursuing comedy. His early stand-up attempts were rough and often unsuccessful, but he kept performing and slowly improved. In the early 1990s, he found success on the sketch comedy show In Living Color, where his character Fire Marshal Bill became a cultural phenomenon. Then came the year that changed everything. 1994, he starred in 3 massive hits: Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, The Mask, and Dumb and Dumber. Films made hundreds of millions worldwide and instantly turned him into the biggest comedy star on the planet. 2 years later, he made Hollywood history by earning $20 million for The Cable Guy, a salary that shocked the entire industry. Yet behind the success, his personal life remained turbulent. His first marriage to actress Melissa Womer produced a daughter, Jane, but ended in divorce as his career exploded. His second marriage to actress Lauren Holly lasted less than a year. Later, he entered a relationship with Irish makeup artist Catriona White, whose tragic death in 2015 triggered years of legal battles and emotional pain for Carrey. Around the same period, his daughter Jane was diagnosed with autism, adding another layer of personal challenge. For decades, he also quietly battled depression. Carrey revealed that he had been taking the antidepressant Prozac since the 1980s to manage what he described as a constant gray fog of sadness. Even while performing some of the most energetic comedy in film history, he was privately managing that internal struggle. A major turning point came after a serious illness that forced him to stop working and confront his life more directly. In the years that followed, he began exploring meditation and spirituality. Influenced by the teachings of Eckhart Tolle and his book The Power of Now, Carrey focused on painting, creating raw and sometimes unsettling artwork that expressed emotions he had never shown publicly before. Eventually, he stepped away from Hollywood almost entirely, moving to a quieter life, and saying he felt he had already done enough. He briefly returned to acting for the Sonic the Hedgehog film series, including Sonic the Hedgehog 3, joking that he accepted the role again because he needed the money. But his priorities had clearly shifted. Painting, reflection, personal peace became more important than fame. So when the world saw him again in Paris at the César Awards and struggled to recognize him, the reaction said more about the audience than about him. Jim Carrey looks different today because his life has been different. He has lived through poverty, family trauma, massive success, personal loss, depression, illness, and spiritual reinvention. The face that confused the internet isn't a clone or a disguise. It's simply the face of someone who has lived a very full and complicated life, and who may finally be comfortable letting the mask fall away. For most people, fame becomes the center of their identity. For Jim Carrey, it eventually became something he started questioning deeply. In interviews over the past decade, he began speaking about success in a way that surprised many fans. Instead of celebrating it, he often described it as an illusion. At one point, he famously said he wished everyone could become rich and famous so they would realize it wasn't the answer. Coming from the man who had once dominated Hollywood box offices, that statement carried weight. It wasn't bitterness. It sounded more like someone who had reached the top of the mountain, only to discover it didn't contain what he expected. During this period, he He poured more energy into art than acting. His paintings became intense, colorful, and sometimes unsettling reflections of politics, identity, and inner emotion. When a short documentary about his artwork titled "I Needed Color" was released online, many people were shocked by how serious and introspective he had become. The film showed a side of Carrey the public rarely saw: quiet, thoughtful, and deeply focused on expressing internal struggles through paint rather than comedy. For a man who once filled theaters with laughter, sitting alone in a studio painting for hours seemed like a completely different life. At the same time, he began speaking more openly about spirituality and presence. Influenced by authors like Eckhart Tolle, Carrey talked about letting go of ego and the identities people build around themselves. In several interviews, he explained that Jim Carrey was partly a character he had, create a role that the world expected him to play. That idea confused some fans, but for him, it was a form of liberation. If the persona was just a role, then he didn't have to perform it forever. That perspective became clear during a widely discussed appearance at the New York Fashion Week in 2017, where he told a reporter there was no me, and that personalities are something people construct. The clip went viral with some viewers calling it brilliant philosophy, and others thinking he sounded lost. But for Carrey, it was simply honesty. After decades of living under the weight of global fame, he seemed determined to dismantle the illusion piece by piece. His later film, roles reflected that shift. Instead of chasing massive comedy blockbusters, he chose projects that felt playful or unusual. When he appeared as the eccentric villain Dr. Robotnik in the Sonic the Hedgehog films, audiences were reminded of the wild physical comedian they loved. Yet interviews around those releases showed a calmer and more reflective version of the actor behind the character. By 2022, he openly suggested he might retire from acting for good. During one conversation, he explained that he felt satisfied with what he had already accomplished. The statement shocked fans because Hollywood stars rarely walk away voluntarily, especially when they still have the power to headline major films. But Carrey didn't sound uncertain. He spoke about enjoying his quiet life, painting, and focusing on his inner world. That's part of why the reaction to his 2026 appearance at the César Awards became so strange. People weren't just reacting to a slightly older face. They were reacting to the fact that the man standing on that stage no longer matched the energetic image they had stored in their memories. The rubber-faced comedian who once bounced across the screen in The Mask or delivered manic performances in Ace Ventura, Pet Detective had evolved into someone quieter and more reflective. In reality, that transformation had been happening slowly. For years, age changes everyone, but Carrey's change felt more dramatic because the original persona had been so exaggerated. The comedian who built a career stretching his face into impossible shapes had trained audiences to expect a kind of cartoon energy forever. When that energy softened with time, people instinctively assumed something strange must have happened. But nothing mysterious actually occurred. The truth is simpler and more human. Jim Carrey lived through experiences that reshaped him: poverty in childhood, massive fame in adulthood, personal losses, depression, illness, self-reflection. Those things leave marks, not just on the mind, but on the face as well. And perhaps that is the most fascinating part of his story. The same man who once built an empire on making people laugh has gradually become someone more interested in understanding life than performing it. Whether he returns to acting again or remains focused on art and spirituality, his journey has already moved far beyond the comedy roles that first made him famous. In the end, the internet conspiracy about clones or imposters says more about how people remember celebrities than about the celebrities themselves. Fans often freeze famous figures in time, expecting them to remain exactly as they appeared during their most popular moments. But real people keep growing, changing, and aging long after the spotlight fades, and that's the reality behind the headlines. The man the internet struggled to recognize in Paris wasn't a clone, a double, or a trick. It was simply Jim Carrey older, wiser, and finally living life on his own terms after decades of making the entire world laugh. What many people are beginning to realize is that Jim Carrey was never just a comedian. The larger-than-life characters, the explosive expressions, and the endless physical comedy were only one layer of who he was. Beneath that layer was always someone observing life very carefully. Someone thinking about meaning, identity, and purpose long before the public ever noticed it. For years, those thoughts stayed mostly hidden behind the characters he played on screen. But as he stepped away from Hollywood, that deeper side slowly became the version of him the world began to see. One of the most revealing things about Carrey in recent years is how openly he talks about identity itself. He often explains that fame creates a kind of performance that never ends. When millions of people expect you to be the same person they remember from a movie, it can feel like you are trapped playing that role forever. In Carrey's case, that role was the hyperactive comedian who could twist his face like rubber and bounce across the screen with endless energy. That image was so powerful that people assumed it was the real him. But according to Carrey, it was only one version of him. One character in a much larger story. That idea became clearer as he shared more of his personal philosophy. Influenced by thinkers like Eckhart Tolle, he began talking about presence, awareness, and the idea that the ego people build around themselves isn't permanent. In several interviews, he explained that success, money, and even fame eventually lose their meaning if they are not connected to something deeper. For someone who once commanded record-breaking salaries and headlined massive Hollywood hits, those words carried a kind of quiet authority. He wasn't speaking as someone who had failed to achieve success. He was speaking as someone who had experienced the very top of it and still searched for something more. Painting became one of the ways he explored that search. While audiences remembered him from films like Dumb and Dumber or The Mask, Carrey was spending hours alone in a studio, creating art that reflected emotions far more complicated than comedy. His paintings often included bold colors, distorted faces, and symbolic imagery that hinted at political frustration, personal reflection, and sometimes deep sadness. It surprised many fans to see such intense work coming from someone whose public image had always been built on laughter. Yet for Carrey, the shift made perfect sense. Comedy had been his survival tool during childhood, a way to keep spirits high when his family struggled with poverty and uncertainty. Humor gave him power in situations where he had very little control. But as his life evolved, he began exploring other forms of expression that allowed him to confront the emotions that comedy had once hidden. Even his occasional returns to acting reflected that awareness. When he appeared in the Sonic the Hedgehog films as the wildly theatrical Dr. Robotnik, audiences were thrilled to see the classic Jim Carrey energy again. The performance felt like a reminder that the comedian everyone loved was still there. At the same time, interviews around the project showed a man who no longer felt the need to prove anything. He treated the role almost like a playful visit back to a world he had already mastered. That balance between humor and reflection may be the clearest picture of who Jim Carrey is today. He hasn't completely abandoned the performer that made him famous, but he also isn't defined by it anymore. Instead, he seems comfortable letting different parts of himself exist at the same time. The comedian, the painter, the thinker, and the man searching for peace away from the spotlight, which brings the story back to that moment in Paris at the César Awards. When people saw him on stage accepting the honorary award, some reacted with confusion because the face they remembered from the 1990s had changed. Time had softened the exaggerated expressions and replaced them with the calmer presence of someone who had lived through decades of extraordinary experiences. But if anything, that transformation might be the most authentic part of his journey. The boy who once slept in a tent during freezing Canadian winters grew into one of the most recognizable entertainers in the world. He conquered Hollywood, earned historic paychecks, survived public heartbreak, faced personal struggles with depression, and eventually stepped back from the spotlight to rebuild his life on his own terms. Very few careers follow a path like that. Even fewer people are willing to walk away from the height of fame once they reach it. Yet Jim Carrey appears to have done exactly that, choosing curiosity, creativity, and inner peace over constant applause. And perhaps that is why the internet's strange conspiracy about clones and imposters spread so quickly. People weren't really reacting to his appearance. They were reacting to change itself. The Jim Carrey they remembered belonged to a different era, a different moment in culture, a different stage of his life. The man standing on that stage in Paris wasn't a replacement or a mystery. He was simply the next version of Jim Carrey, someone who had spent decades making the world laugh and was now finally comfortable letting the performance end, even if only for a while.